There is a set of equations that describes what is hidden inside a black hole, the vast invisible count of quantum states packed behind the horizon, and it was written down in 1920 by a dying man in South India who said a goddess placed it on his tongue while he slept. He proved none of it. Then he died at 32. That is not a legend, and it is not a flourish. The functions are real, they were published, and in 2012 3 physicists confirmed they are exactly what you need to count the quantum states inside a black hole. He had been dead for 92 years, and he had never once heard the words black hole, because the idea did not exist while he was alive. His name was Srinivasa Ramanujan. He failed out of college twice. He mailed roughly 120 theorems to a stranger at Cambridge in 1913 with no proofs attached, and 2 professors returned them without a word. He left behind nearly 4,000 results, almost all of them correct, in notebooks that were very nearly burned before anyone read them. We have spent 100 years proving he was right, and not one moment explaining how he knew. So settle in. If you have not yet, subscribe or join, and there is a Patreon where these longer trips through physics, mathematics, and the people it broke run wider and deeper than any single video can. Stay to the end, because by the time we get there, the goddess is going to be the least strange part of this. And the question of where his mathematics actually came from is going to follow you out of the room. Let's go back to where this began. In January of 1920, a dying man in southern India wrote a letter to a mathematician in England. He had about 3 months left to live. His body was failing in ways the doctors could not name. He could barely sit up, and his wife was feeding him by hand because he could no longer feed himself. And in that letter, in between apologies for not having written sooner, he described a new kind of mathematical object that he said he had discovered. He called them mock theta functions. He gave 17 examples of them, written out in his small, careful hand. He did not prove a single one. He did not explain where they came from or how he had found them. He wrote them down the way a man writes down something he has been shown and is copying out before it slips away. Then he stopped writing, and a few weeks later he was dead, and he was 32 years old. For the next 82 years, nobody on earth could explain what those functions actually were. Not the man he had sent them to, who was one of the most celebrated mathematicians of his age. Not the British number theorist who spent the better part of a decade staring at them. Not the entire machinery of 20th century mathematics, with all its journals and its institutes and its Fields medals. The functions just sat there, in the literature. They were correct. You could use them. They produced right answers. And nobody could say what kind of thing they were. The way you might have a working engine in front of you that runs perfectly and that you cannot open and cannot understand. They were, in the words of one of the mathematicians who later cracked them, the deepest and most mysterious objects he had ever worked with. And then, in 2012, 3 physicists working on string theory and black holes published a paper that explained what those functions were for. Not what they were, exactly, what they were for. They turned out to be the natural language for counting the quantum states of certain black holes. A dying clerk in Madras had written down, in the last weeks of his life, for reasons he never gave, the precise mathematical structures that physics would need 90 years later to describe the interior accounting of a black hole. And he had no idea what a black hole was. The concept did not exist. The mathematics that would eventually require his functions would not be invented for another 50 years. I want you to sit with how strange that is, because the story you have probably heard about this man does not contain it. The story you have heard is a nice story. It is the story of the poor self-taught Indian genius who taught himself mathematics from a single book, who was discovered by a kind professor at Cambridge, who became famous, and who died young and tragic, and whose life was made into a respectful film with a respectful title. That version is true. Every fact in it is accurate. And it is also a sanitized version, the way a lot of stories about uncomfortable things get sanitized. Because the real story contains a question that nobody in a position of authority has ever been able to answer, and the polite thing to do with an unanswerable question is to leave it out of the movie. The question is this: where did the mathematics come from? Not in the vague, inspirational sense, in the literal sense. This man, Srinivasa Ramanujan, produced something on the order of 4,000 mathematical results in his short life, the overwhelming majority of which have since been proven correct, many of which were decades, or in some cases, a full century ahead of the rest of the field. And he produced them with almost no formal training, almost no access to current mathematics, and, by his own repeated insistence, no method that he could describe to anyone. He said the formulas came to him in dreams. He said a goddess named Namagiri wrote them on his tongue while he slept, and that he would wake and write down what he had seen. He told his friends, more than once, that an equation had no meaning for him unless it expressed a thought of God. Now, the standard move at this point, the move every respectable account makes, is to gently set that aside, to treat the goddess as a charming bit of cultural color, a thing a devout man from a temple town in colonial India would naturally say, and to assume that underneath it there was some ordinary cognitive process we simply have not identified yet. And maybe that is right. I want to be honest with you that I do not know, and that nobody knows, and that the assumption that he was obviously wrong about where his mathematics came from is exactly that. An assumption. It is not a finding. No one has ever produced a better account of his method, because he left no method. He left answers. Page after page of answers, correct answers, to questions nobody had thought to ask, and when the best mathematician of his generation sat with those answers across a table from him and asked how he had arrived at them, the man could not say. He did not seem to think the question was important. The answers were simply there, the way a landscape is there when you open your eyes. That is the thing the nice version leaves out. We have spent 100 years proving that Ramanujan was right. We have spent 0 years successfully explaining how he could possibly have known. And the longer you look at the actual record, the dates, the documents, the functions that keep turning out to be true in places they had no business being true, the harder it becomes to hold on to the comfortable assumption that this was just an unusually gifted brain doing unusually fast arithmetic. Something else was happening. I cannot tell you what. I can only tell you that by the time we get to the end of this, the goddess is going to seem like the least strange part of the story, and the part that should actually unsettle you is going to be a question about whether the mathematics he was finding was ever really his to find, or whether it was already there, waiting, indifferent, the way a mountain range is already there before anyone, and whether the same thing is true of everything we call discovery. But to get there, we have to go back, because this did not start at the deathbed. It started with a book. The year was 1903. Ramanujan was 16 years old, living in the town of Kumbakonam in the Madras Presidency of British India, a temple town about 160 miles south of the city of Madras itself. His family were Tamil Brahmins, which is to say high caste and respectable and extremely poor, a combination that was common and miserable in roughly equal measure. His father worked as a clerk in a sari shop for about 20 rupees a month. 3 of his younger siblings had already died in infancy. The house was small, and into that house, by a route nobody fully documented, came a book with one of the least promising titles in the history of important objects. It was called A Synopsis of Elementary Results in Pure and Applied Mathematics, written by a man named George Shoebridge Carr, and published in England in 1880. It was not a textbook in any normal sense. It was a cram book, a dense compressed list of around 4,800 mathematical results that Carr had assembled to help English students pass their examinations, and it stated those results mostly without proof. Theorem after theorem after theorem, bare, stripped, no working shown. For almost any student in the world, a book like that is useless, or worse. You cannot learn mathematics from a list of conclusions with the reasoning removed. It is like trying to learn to cook from a list of finished dishes. But something about the format of that book, the bareness of it, the 4,800 unproven assertions hanging there asking to be justified, lit something in this particular 16-year-old that has no real parallel that I am aware of. He did not read it the way you read a book. He took each result as a kind of personal challenge, and he set about reconstructing the missing proofs himself, and then going further, generating new results the book had never mentioned, filling notebooks with them. He stopped doing anything else, and here is where the nice story starts to acquire its first shadow, because the cost of this was not abstract. He had won a scholarship to a government college in Kumbakonam, a real achievement for a boy of his background, a genuine path out of poverty, and he lost it. Within a year, not because he failed at mathematics, but because he refused to do anything except mathematics, and so he failed English, he failed physiology, he failed everything that was not the thing that had taken hold of him, and the scholarship was withdrawn. He tried again at another college in Madras. He failed again, the same way, for the same reason. So picture this. By the time he was in his late teens, by every official measure that his society could apply, Srinivasa Ramanujan was a failure. A college dropout twice over. A young man who could not hold the attention required to pass the exams that ordinary clerks passed routinely. Because his attention was permanently elsewhere, locked onto a thing nobody around him could see the point of. He had no degree, no prospects, and a growing pile of notebooks full of results that, as far as the people around him could tell, were the private obsession of someone who had gone slightly strange. Here is the detail I keep coming back to. Those notebooks, the ones he filled in those wilderness years between 1903 and roughly 1911, the ones produced by a failed student with no audience and no encouragement, contain results that mathematicians are still proving today. A man at the University of Illinois named Bruce Berndt spent more than 40 years of his professional life, from the late 1970s onward, editing and proving the contents of those notebooks, and he produced 5 thick volumes doing it. And he has said plainly that the experience changed how he thinks about mathematical ability. 40 years of one of the great modern number theorists to catch up with what an unemployed 20-year-old had scribbled down for no one. And the unemployed 20-year-old had shown no working, just the results, sitting there, correct, waiting to be earned by people with far more training than he ever had. There is a particular pair of results in those early notebooks that tells you everything about the situation he was trapped in, and it is worth slowing down on. They are now called the Rogers-Ramanujan identities, 2 statements relating certain infinite sums to certain infinite products, and they are, even today, considered among the most beautiful identities in all of mathematics, the kind of thing that makes working mathematicians go quiet the first time they really see them. Ramanujan found them alone, in Madras, with no one to tell. And here is the part that should make your jaw tighten. They had already been discovered. A British mathematician named Leonard James Rogers had found and proven them back in 1894 and published them, and the entire mathematical world had ignored him. Because Rogers was an obscure figure in an obscure post, and the work was buried in a paper nobody read. So you have two men, decades and continents apart, both reaching the same extraordinary truth, and the establishment managing to overlook it both times. It was only after Ramanujan rediscovered the identities and could not prove them in the rigorous sense, and the problem began circulating among the people Hardy knew, that someone finally dug up Rogers's forgotten paper, and the world realized what it had been sitting on for 20 years. The mathematics was there the whole time. It had been found, written down, published, and shelved. And it still took an isolated clerk in India arriving at it independently to force anyone to look. That is not a story about genius. That is a story about how badly the system sees, even when the truth is lying in its own archives, in its own language, with a name and a date on it. The notebooks also contained things that look, on first encounter, like the work of a madman. Until you understand them, and then they look like the work of someone standing somewhere the rest of us cannot stand. There is a place where Ramanujan essentially writes down that if you add up all the positive whole numbers, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 and onward forever, the answer is -1/12. Read that again. The sum of every positive number there is, a sum that obviously runs off to infinity, set equal to a small negative fraction. To a normal person, that is gibberish. To a careless person, it is a famous internet curiosity. To Ramanujan, it was a precise and meaningful statement about a deep object called the Riemann zeta function, a way of assigning a finite, sensible value to a process that naively diverges, and it happens to be exactly the value that physics, decades later, would need when it ran into the very same infinite sums in quantum field theory and had to find a way to tame them and extract real, measurable predictions from them. He could not have known that. He arrived at it on his own, and he put a version of it in his first letter to Hardy, and it was one of the things that nearly made Hardy stop reading, because it looked insane, until you understood what it actually was. Ramanujan himself wrote, with a kind of weary foreknowledge of how he would be received, that he had found a way to handle these divergent series, and that if he explained his methods to an ordinary mathematician, they would point him straight to the lunatic asylum. He knew exactly how it looked. He wrote it down anyway, because it was true, and he could see that it was true, and his seeing never waited for permission. By around 1910, the notebooks had begun, slowly, to find a few readers in India who understood that something real was happening. A mathematician named V. Ramaswamy Iyer, who had founded the Indian Mathematical Society, met Ramanujan and was stunned by what he was looking at. A wealthy and well-connected man named Ramachandra Rao, a district collector and a patron of mathematics, was persuaded to support him, and for a time simply paid Ramanujan a small monthly sum out of his own pocket, around 25 rupees, so that the young man could do nothing but mathematics. Think about the strangeness of that arrangement. A grown married man being privately financed to sit and fill notebooks, like a family quietly keeping a relative whose condition cannot quite be named in public. Ramanujan hated it. He did not want charity. He wanted work and recognition, not to be a kept curiosity living on another man's goodwill. In 1911, he published his first real paper on certain properties of a class of numbers called Bernoulli numbers in the Journal of the Indian Mathematical Society, and it was strong, and it was noticed by the small Indian mathematical world, and it still amounted to almost nothing, because the only people on earth who could actually measure what he was were 8,000 miles away and did not know that he existed. I am telling you about the notebooks now, this early, because I need you to carry an image with you for the rest of this. The image is of answers arriving without the work that is supposed to produce answers. It is going to come back. It is going to come back at the deathbed, and it is going to come back in a library at Cambridge in 1976, and it is going to come back in a way that I genuinely do not know how to think about, in a physics paper in 2012. The man produced conclusions the way other people produce opinions, instantly and without visible derivation, except that his conclusions kept turning out to be true. Hold that. By 1912, the practical situation had become untenable. He was a married man now. He had been married in 1909, in an arranged match typical of the time and place, to a girl named Janaki who was 9 years old at the wedding, an age that is jarring to modern ears and was entirely ordinary in his community then. They would not actually live together for some years. But a married man needs an income. And so through the intervention of a few people in Madras, who had begun to suspect that the strange notebooks might be the work of someone real, Ramanujan got a job. In March of 1912, he was hired as a clerk, grade 4, in the accounts department of the Madras Port Trust, keeping the books of the harbour for 30 rupees a month. He was good at it, by all accounts fast and accurate, which you would expect. And in the margins of the ledgers and on whatever scrap paper he could find, in between recording the comings and goings of cargo, he kept doing the other thing, the thing that had cost him everything and earned him nothing. It would be easy to make that into a heartwarming detail, the genius doing math in the margins. But think about what it actually was. A man in his mid-20s who knew, with total certainty, that he was capable of something enormous, sitting in an accounts office in a colonial port, copying numbers about freight, watching the years go by, with no way to reach the only people on earth who might understand what he was carrying. He was not undiscovered because his work was poor. He was undiscovered because of geography and empire and the simple, brutal fact that the gatekeepers of mathematics were 8,000 miles away and had no reason on earth to read a letter from a clerk. He had, in fact, already tried to reach some of them. And that is where the story turns, and where it gets in a quiet way infuriating, because before the famous letter, the one that worked, there were letters that did not. Sometime around 1912, with the encouragement of the small circle in Madras who believed in him, Ramanujan began writing to established mathematicians in England, enclosing samples of his results, asking essentially to be taken seriously. He wrote to a man named H.F. Baker, a distinguished algebraic geometer, a former president of the London Mathematical Society. Baker returned the work without comment. He wrote to E.W. Hobson, who held one of the most senior mathematical chairs at Cambridge, the Sadlerian Professorship of Pure Mathematics. Hobson also returned the papers without comment. Two of the most eminent mathematicians in the British Empire received pages of what we now know to be genuinely extraordinary mathematics, in some cases results that were decades ahead of the field, from an unknown Indian correspondent, and they sent it back without a word, not with a rejection, not with a critique, without comment. I want to name what that is, because the standard telling glides right past it. That is not a story about two busy men making an understandable mistake. It is a story about a system that had decided in advance whose mathematics was worth reading, and the deciding factor was not the mathematics. There is no chance, none, that if those identical pages had arrived from a Cambridge undergraduate, they would have been returned in silence. The pages were the same. The only variable was the man. And the response of the institution, the response of the people whose entire professional purpose was to recognize mathematical truth when it was placed in front of them, was to fail to recognize it because of where it came from. Both Baker and Hobson, by the way, would within a few years be among the people formally proposing Ramanujan for the highest honor British science had to offer. They came around, but only after someone else had done the recognizing for them, and only after the someone else turned out to be right. That pattern, the establishment refusing to see a thing until a higher status member of the establishment forces it to, is not unique to this story. It runs through the entire history of how knowledge gets accepted, and you are going to see it again before we are done, and each time you see it, you should let yourself feel a little of the anger it deserves. And then, on the 16th of January, 1913, Ramanujan wrote one more letter. This one went to a 35-year-old fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, named Godfrey Harold Hardy. G.H. Hardy and Hardy, unlike the others, read it. The letter ran to about 9 pages. It opened with a now famous passage of disarming honesty. He introduced himself as a clerk in the accounts department of the Port Trust at Madras, on a salary of £20 a year. He said he was about 23 years of age. He said he had no university education, but had been employing the spare time at his disposal to work at mathematics, that he had not trodden the conventional regular course followed at a university, but was, in his words, striking out a new path for himself. And then came the mathematics. Somewhere around 120 results, theorems and formulas, stated as Ramanujan always stated them, boldly, without proof, taking up page after page. What was actually in those pages is worth describing, because the range of it is part of what unhinged Hardy. There were results on infinite series, on definite integrals, on the distribution of the prime numbers, and on continued fractions, those strange staircase expressions where a number is written as a fraction whose denominator contains another fraction, whose denominator contains another, descending forever. One of the continued fraction results in particular stopped Hardy cold, and stayed with him for the rest of his life as the single most astonishing thing in the letter, because a false continued fraction of that complexity is essentially impossible to manufacture. The pieces have to lock together perfectly down through infinitely many levels, and a fraud or a fool produces something that falls apart by the 3rd or 4th step, and this did not fall apart anywhere. And Hardy could not see how a human being unaided had arrived at it. Some of the results in the letter were things Hardy recognized as already known, though stated in unfamiliar ways. Some he could see were new, but reachable with existing methods if you worked hard enough. And some, the ones that mattered, were in a 3rd category that Hardy essentially had to invent on the spot to hold them. A category of results that were new and difficult, and almost certainly true, and that he could not place at all, that seemed to have been quarried out of a mathematics that did not yet exist. Hardy's first reaction was the same reaction Baker and Hobson had presumably had. He found it bewildering, and his instinct was that it was probably the work of a crank. He looked at it during the day, set it aside, and went about his business, which on that particular day reportedly included a game of cricket, because Hardy loved cricket nearly as much as he loved mathematics. But the letter would not leave him alone. There were formulas in it that he could not classify. Some of them he recognized, or half recognized, as things that were known, though stated in unfamiliar ways. Some of them he could see were within reach of existing methods. But others, and this is the crucial part, others were of a kind he had never seen in his life, and they had a quality that genuinely disturbed him, which was that they were too strange to be the work of a fraud, and too correct to be the work of a fool. A crank produces nonsense. A mediocre mathematician produces things that are either trivially true or simply wrong. These were neither. These were bizarre, and as far as Hardy could tell, true. That evening he did something that tells you he could not let it go. He took the letter to the one person at Cambridge whose mathematical judgment he trusted as much as his own, his close collaborator John Edensor Littlewood. And the two of them sat down together that night and went through the pages. Hardy and Littlewood were, at that point, very probably the two finest pure mathematicians in England. There is a famous joke from the era that there were three great English mathematicians, Hardy, Littlewood, and Hardy Littlewood, because the two of them together formed a third entity more powerful than either alone. And these two men spent that evening, by all accounts late into the night, working through the letter of an unknown clerk, and what happened to them over the course of that evening was a kind of collapse of certainty. The longer they looked, the clearer it became that they were not looking at the work of a clever amateur. They were looking at the work of someone operating at a level neither of them had encountered before, in a mind that had reached conclusions they could not have reached, and in some cases could not yet justify. Hardy wrote about it later, and his description has become the single most quoted assessment in the history of mathematical genius, and it deserves to be quoted exactly, because the precision of it matters. He wrote that the formulas defeated him completely, that he had never seen anything in the least like them before. He wrote that a single look at them was enough to show that they could only be written down by a mathematician of the highest class. And then he wrote the sentence that I want you to really hear, because it is doing something more than praising. He wrote that they must be true, because if they were not true, no one would have the imagination to invent them. Read that again slowly, because it is a stranger sentence than it looks. Hardy, one of the most rigorous logicians of his century, a man who built his entire career on the principle that a thing is not mathematically true until it is proven, is looking at a page of unproven assertions from a man he has never met, and he is concluding that they are true on the grounds that they are too imaginative to be false. That is not a mathematical argument. That is something closer to an aesthetic or even a theological one. He is saying, in effect, that these formulas have a quality of necessary truth that he can perceive directly. Before any proof, a quality so distinctive that forgery is ruled out not by checking the work, but by the impossibility of a human mind inventing something that strange and having it also be wrong. Hardy spent the rest of his life as an atheist who was deeply uncomfortable with anything that smelled of the mystical, and the most important judgment of his career was, at bottom, an act of faith. He invited Ramanujan to Cambridge, but that invitation, which looks from this distance like the obvious happy turn in the story, was very nearly impossible to act on, and the reason is the first time the goddess enters the record as a force that actually changed history. To understand the problem, you have to understand that Ramanujan was not just a Hindu. He was an orthodox Tamil Brahmin, and one of the things his orthodoxy forbade was crossing the sea. There was a concept, Kalapani, the black water, the belief that to cross the ocean was to sever yourself from the regenerating waters of the Ganges and from the social and ritual order of your caste, to lose your purity, to fall out of the world that gave your life meaning. For a Brahmin of Ramanujan's strictness, going to England was not an inconvenience. It was a kind of spiritual death, and it would have horrified his mother, Komala Tammal, whose approval governed the household and who had every intention of refusing. And then his mother had a dream. The way the story is recorded, and it is recorded by people who knew the family. Komala Tammal had a dream in which she saw her son seated in a great hall surrounded by Europeans, and the family goddess Namagiri, the same Namagiri who Ramanujan said wrote equations on his tongue, commanded her to stand aside and to no longer obstruct her son from fulfilling his purpose. And on the strength of that dream, the prohibition was lifted. The mother gave her blessing. the single most consequential journey in the history of modern mathematics. The journey that brought Ramanujan's work out of the margins of a Madras ledger and into the bloodstream of world mathematics happened because a goddess appeared in a dream and gave permission. Now, you can do with that what you like. You can call it a convenient family narrative, a face-saving device, a coincidence dressed up after the fact. I am not going to tell you what it was, but I am going to point out, because almost no one does, that the supernatural is not a decoration on the edges of this story. It is load-bearing. Remove the goddess, and Ramanujan does not pick up the book with the same intensity, does not credit his results to anything outside himself, does not get permission to sail, does not reach Cambridge, does not become Ramanujan. Every respectable account treats the religion as the soft human background to the hard mathematical foreground. But the religion keeps showing up at exactly the moments where the story would otherwise have stopped. And the man himself never wavered, not once, in his insistence that the mathematics and the goddess were the same thing. We are the ones who decided they had to be separated. He never agreed. He sailed from Madras on the 17th of March, 1914, aboard a steamship called the Navassa, and arrived in England in April, into the cold, into a world about to tear itself apart. Because within 4 months of his arrival, the First World War would begin, and the part of the story that everyone treats as the triumph, the arrival of the genius at the great university, the meeting of the two minds, was also, from the very first, the beginning of the thing that would kill him. But before we get to how Cambridge destroyed him, you need to see what he and Hardy actually did there, because it is the only way to understand what was lost. What they did, first, was confront the proof problem, because here is the uncomfortable thing about Ramanujan that his admirers tend to soften. In the strict sense of the word that Hardy cared about most, Ramanujan often did not prove his results. He asserted them. He saw them. Littlewood, who worked with him too, put it about as bluntly as a colleague could, observing that the clear-cut idea of what is meant by a proof, Ramanujan perhaps did not possess at all. Think about what that sentence is claiming. It is claiming that one of the most productive mathematical minds in recorded history may not have fully grasped the central activity that the entire discipline of mathematics is built on. The activity of demonstrating why a thing is true rather than merely asserting that it is. And he was right anyway. Over and over and over, he was right. He would produce a formula by means he could not articulate. Hardy would labor to construct a rigorous proof of it using the full apparatus of modern analysis, and the proof would confirm what Ramanujan had simply known. The genius and the proof were two different people. One of them saw the destination. The other one built the road after the fact, to a place that was already there. I have been treating Hardy as a supporting character, the man who happened to receive the letter, but you need to understand who he actually was, because the partnership between these two men is the strangest professional relationship in the history of science, and it tells you something about both of them and about the thing they were both reaching for. Godfrey Harold Hardy was born in 1877, and he was, by his own description, a cold man who found human intimacy difficult and who poured everything he had into two things, mathematics and cricket. He was a militant atheist who treated God as a personal adversary, who would not enter a chapel even for the ceremonial occasions a Cambridge fellow was expected to attend, and who once, before a sea crossing, sent a colleague a postcard claiming he had proven a famous theorem on the theory that God would not allow him to drown and receive the credit falsely, and so would keep the ship afloat. That is the man. The atheist who tried to blackmail a God he did not believe in. And this is the man who, presented with a devout Hindu, who said a goddess wrote mathematics on his tongue while he slept, became that man's fiercest champion and, in time, something close to the love of his life. Because Hardy, the cold rationalist, did love him. There is no other word that fits the record. Late in his own life, Hardy wrote that his association with Ramanujan was the one romantic incident in his life, and Hardy was not a man who used a word like romantic loosely or often. He called Ramanujan the most romantic figure in the recent history of mathematics, and he produced, for the benefit of younger mathematicians, including Paul Erdos, a private ranking that has since become legendary, in which he rated mathematicians on a scale of natural talent from 0 to 100. He gave himself a 25. He gave Littlewood, his brilliant lifelong collaborator, a 30. He gave David Hilbert, widely regarded as the greatest mathematician then alive, an 80. And he gave Ramanujan a 100. Hardy, one of the finest mathematicians England has ever produced, placed himself at 25 out of 100, 4 times below the clerk from Madras. And he was not being modest, because modesty was not in his nature and precision was. He had measured himself against the real thing, and he knew exactly how far short he fell. And being an honest man, he said so out loud. And when someone later asked Hardy to name his single greatest contribution to mathematics, this man, with a career full of first-rate work, answered without hesitation that it was the discovery of Ramanujan. He considered the most important thing he ever did to be the recognition of someone else. That is the human core of the collaboration, and it matters for the mathematics, because it means that everything Hardy did, with every proof he painstakingly built underneath one of Ramanujan's intuitions, he did in a state close to reverence, fully aware that he was the lesser talent serving as scribe and translator for a mind he could not match. The most rigorous mathematician in England understood his own role in the partnership accurately, to be that of an apprentice taking dictation from a man who could not explain himself, building slow, careful, logical staircases up to conclusions that Ramanujan had simply found himself already standing on top of. I do not know of another collaboration in the history of the field where the senior, more famous, more technically rigorous partner described himself, correctly, as the junior one. That division of labor produced, over the next few years, some of the most beautiful mathematics of the 20th century, and I want to give you at least one piece of it in enough detail that you can feel the texture of it, because the abstraction is the enemy here. Take the problem of partition. The number of partitions of a whole number is just a number of distinct ways you can write it as a sum of positive whole numbers. The number 4, for example, can be written as 4, or 3 plus 1, or 2 plus 2, or 2 plus 1 plus 1, or 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. 5 ways. So the partition number of 4 is 5. Simple to define. A child can understand the question, and it explodes with terrifying speed. The partition number of 100 is already greater than 190 million. The partition number of 200 is nearly 4 trillion. The function grows so fast and so erratically that for a long time there was no hope of a formula that would let you calculate it directly for large numbers, instead of grinding through the partitions one by one, which becomes impossible almost immediately. Hardy and Ramanujan attacked it together in a paper published in 1918, and what they produced was not just a formula, but an entirely new technique, now called the circle method, which became one of the central tools of 20th century number theory and is still in heavy use today. But the part of that collaboration that haunts me is smaller and more human. Ramanujan, working from his usual mysterious intuition, kept insisting that the formula they were building was not just an approximation, but was astonishingly, unreasonably accurate. Far more accurate than Hardy thought it had any right to be. And he was correct. The formula was so precise that you could use it to calculate the exact partition number, a whole number, by computing the value of a continuous expression and simply rounding to the nearest integer. A continuous analytic expression, full of square roots and exponentials and the number pi, reaching across to land exactly on a whole number, the count of something discrete and combinatorial. There was something almost unreasonable about that accuracy, and the story of it did not end with the two of them. 2 decades later, in 1937, a mathematician named Hans Rademacher took the Hardy and Ramanujan approach one step further and produced a formula that was not merely a stunningly good approximation, but was exact. An infinite series that converges precisely onto the partition number with no rounding required at all. The road that Ramanujan had sensed the end of, that he and Hardy had paved most of the way, was finally carried all the way to the destination by someone else, after he was dead, arriving exactly where his intuition had said the ground would be. Ramanujan sensed that landing before the mathematics justified it. He always sensed the landing first, and the mathematics, every time, eventually arrived to find him already there. And now I have to tell you the other side of this, because if I only show you the times he was right, then I am doing the same sanitizing I accused everyone else of, and you deserve better than that. Ramanujan was not infallible. There was at least one major claim in that first letter that was simply wrong, and the way it was wrong is one of the most illuminating things in the entire story. He claimed, with his usual total confidence, to have a formula for the number of primes up to a given size, the prime counting function, one of the famously hard problems in all of mathematics. And he believed his formula was exact, or very nearly exact. It was not. It was a remarkably good approximation, far better than a man working in isolation had any right to produce. But it was wrong in a specific and deep way, and when Hardy and Littlewood dug into it, they found the flaw, and the flaw is the whole point. Ramanujan had reconstructed, from nothing, by pure intuition, an approximation to the distribution of the primes that had cost European mathematics a century of collective effort to reach. But he had missed something that you cannot intuit your way to. There are tiny oscillating correction terms riding on top of the smooth approximation. And those corrections come from the zeros of the Riemann zeta function, the deepest and most famous unsolved object in mathematics, and they are invisible to feel. You cannot sense them. You have to build the heavy machinery of complex analysis and go looking, and only then do they appear. Ramanujan had no machinery. He had only the vision. And the vision, which had carried him further than anyone alive, hit a hard wall at exactly the boundary where seeing requires construction rather than sight. He could see the smooth shape of the truth. He could not see the fine tremor on its surface, because the tremor does not show itself to intuition. So here is what that tells you, and it is not a knock on him, it is the opposite of a knock. The places where Ramanujan got things wrong map out, with eerie precision, the exact border between what can be perceived directly and what can only be derived through formal apparatus. He failed in precisely the places where the truth is hidden from sight and available only to proof. Everywhere else, across the vast territory that can simply be seen, if you have eyes that can see it. He was right, which leaves a question hanging that should bother you more than his mistakes do. What kind of eyes were those? While this was happening, the war was on, and Ramanujan was alone in a way that is hard to overstate. Cambridge emptied out as the younger men went to the front. Littlewood himself was doing war work and was largely absent. The weather was cold, in a way a man from southern India had never experienced, and the food was the slow catastrophe. Ramanujan was a strict vegetarian on religious grounds and an orthodox Brahmin who would not eat food prepared by others or in vessels that violated his observances, which meant, in practice, that he had to cook for himself, often late at night after working. And after 1916, as wartime rationing tightened, the ingredients he needed simply were not available. The fresh vegetables, the particular foods of home, the things his body and his religion both required, vanished from a Britain that was strangling under a German naval blockade. So this man, this once-in-a-century mind, sat in cold rooms in a deserted wartime college, 8,000 miles from anyone who loved him, slowly starving himself out of religious conviction, in a country that could not feed him even if he had been willing to eat what it offered. And he kept working. The mathematics did not slow down. If anything, it intensified, the way things sometimes intensify in people who can feel the time getting short. I want to sit inside that loneliness for a moment, because it is easy to say the word isolated and move on, and the reality of it was a slow, daily grinding thing. Picture the actual texture of his days. A man raised in the heat and color and noise of a South Indian temple town, surrounded his whole life by family and ritual, and the smell of cooking and the sound of his own language, set down alone in the grey damp cold of a half-empty wartime Cambridge, in rooms he could not properly heat, eating food he had to cook himself late at night out of dwindling ingredients, unable to share a meal with anyone because of his observances, working until his eyes failed in the dark and the cold, with the one man who understood his mathematics often away on war duty and the rest of the young men gone to die in France. He was homesick in a way that went bone deep. He missed his mother. He missed his wife, with whom he had barely lived. He wrote home, and the letters were slow, and the war made everything slower. And around all of it was the simple fact that there was no one anywhere within thousands of miles who could fully meet him where his mind lived. Hardy came closest, and Hardy was the first to say that he could not actually follow Ramanujan to the places the younger man went, that he could only verify, afterward, that the places were real. Hardy described him, in the end, as standing in a class entirely by himself, as a phenomenon that the ordinary scale of mathematical ability could not measure. And Hardy meant it not as praise, but as a plain statement of a difficulty. There was no one to talk to at the level he needed, because at that level there was only him. He was the most gifted mathematician of his generation, and he was profoundly, structurally alone, and the two facts were the same fact. And it was killing him as surely as the cold and the hunger were. In 1916, Cambridge awarded him a Bachelor of Arts by research, on the strength of a paper on what are called highly composite numbers, numbers with more divisors than any smaller number, a paper so substantial that the part of it Cambridge published was actually a truncated version, with a long continuation that was considered too much and that did not see print in full for 80 years. Even his degree thesis was too large to print, and in the spring of 1917, his body began to give out. He fell seriously ill. The doctors of the time diagnosed tuberculosis with severe vitamin deficiency, the predictable result of years of malnutrition. He was moved in and out of a series of sanatoria across England, places with names like Matlock and Mendip Hills, cold institutions in the English countryside where the standard treatment for the disease they thought he had was fresh air and rest, which is to say, more cold, more isolation, more time alone in his head. And it was during this period, the sickest and loneliest stretch of his life, that the second piece of the story that the nice version leaves out occurred. At some point in late 1917 or early 1918, in the grip of his illness and his isolation, and what we would now almost certainly recognize as severe depression, Srinivasa Ramanujan attempted to kill himself. He threw himself in front of a train on the London Underground. He survived because the driver saw him and braked in time. He was arrested because attempting suicide was a crime in Britain then, and Hardy intervened, going to Scotland Yard and, depending on which account you believe, somewhat bending the truth to get the charges dropped, telling the authorities that Ramanujan was a Fellow of the Royal Society, which was not quite yet true, but was about to be. The episode was hushed up at the time and stayed largely out of the public story for decades, and you can understand why. It does not fit the triumphant narrative. It is much easier to talk about the man who saw the partition formula than the man who lay down in front of a train in a foreign country in the dark. But they were the same man, on the same days. And the second fact is as true as the first. There is a detail here that I find almost unbearable, which comes from that 1994 medical reanalysis I will get to properly later. If the modern reassessment of his illness is right, and the thing that was killing him was not tuberculosis at all, but a parasitic infection of the liver, then it was a condition that even in 1918 was curable, and it was a condition known to produce, among its symptoms, exactly the kind of depression that drives a person to a train platform. He may have tried to die of a chemical despair manufactured by an illness that the medicine of his own day could have cured, if anyone had correctly named it. Nobody named it. They sent him to the cold and told him to rest. And here is the part that recontextualizes everything before it. The second time I am going to ask you to hold an image. While this was happening, while his body was failing and his mind was going dark and he was being shuttled between sanatoria, the mathematics kept arriving. The functions that would, almost a century later, describe the quantum structure of black holes were not the product of his healthy years. The deepest, strangest things he ever wrote down came at the very end, when he was at his most depleted, his most isolated, his most physically destroyed. As the man fell apart, the mathematics got stranger and deeper and further ahead of its time. Whatever the source was, it did not run on his well-being. It seemed almost to feed on the collapse. I do not know what to do with that. I am not going to pretend that I do. But I am not going to leave it out either, because it is in the record, and the people who leave it out are choosing comfort over accuracy. And you came here for the accurate version. In the same stretch of darkness, the honors began to arrive with a timing that is almost cruel. In 1918, while he was sick and recently suicidal, Ramanujan was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, the oldest scientific institution in the world, at the age of 31, one of the youngest fellows in its history, and only the second Indian ever elected. The certificate of election described him, in the dry formal language of the society, as distinguished as a pure mathematician, particularly for his investigations in elliptic functions and the theory of numbers. He was also elected a Fellow of Trinity College, the first Indian to be so honored. The clerk who had failed out of college twice, who had been sent home from 2 schools for caring about the wrong thing, was now formally one of the most honored mathematicians alive. And he was dying, and he knew it, and the honors landed on a man who could barely get out of bed. It is from this same period, the sick years, that the most famous anecdote in all of mathematics comes, and I want to tell it properly, because it is usually told as a cute story, and it is not a cute story. It is a window into how this man's mind actually worked, and it is unsettling if you look at it directly. Hardy went to visit Ramanujan in a nursing home in Putney, in southwest London. Hardy was not good at small talk, was famously awkward at the human parts of life, and casting about for something to say as he came in. He remarked that he had arrived in a taxicab, whose number was 1729, and that it seemed to him a rather dull number, and he hoped it was not a bad omen. And Ramanujan, sick, bedridden, immediately, without pause, said no. It is a very interesting number. It is the smallest number that can be written as the sum of two cubes in two different ways. Sit with the mechanics of that for a second, because the cuteness hides the strangeness. Hardy says a number, essentially at random, a number he picked out of nothing, because it was painted on the side of a cab. And Ramanujan, with no warning, no time to think, no paper, instantly knows a specific, true, and deeply non-obvious property of that exact number. A property that distinguishes it from every smaller number in existence. 1729 is 1 cubed plus 12 cubed, and it is also 9 cubed plus 10 cubed, and it is the smallest number for which that double representation exists. That is not a fact a normal mathematician carries around. It is not a fact you would know unless you had at some point considered the cubes and their sums in a way that no curriculum asks anyone to consider them. And he did not retrieve it. He produced it in real time, as if the number had simply told him what it was when Hardy said it out loud. Littlewood's comment about Ramanujan, after years of knowing him, was that every positive integer was one of his personal friends. He did not mean it as a metaphor about diligence. He meant that the man appeared to have a relationship with individual numbers that the rest of us do not have with anything, a relationship in which the numbers, when addressed, answered, "That is the man." And in 1919, with the war over and his body broken, he went home to India, hoping the warmth of home would do what the cold sanatoria could not. It did not. He arrived in March of 1919, and he was already too far gone. And here is the detail I promised you I would come back to, the question of what was actually killing him, because it is its own small tragedy folded inside the large one. For most of a century, the official answer was tuberculosis. That is what the English doctors decided. That is what went into the record. That is what the sanatoria with their fresh air and their bed rest were treating. But in 1994, a physician named Dr. Donald Young published a careful retrospective analysis of Ramanujan's medical history in the records of the Royal Society, working back through the documented symptoms, the pattern of the fevers, the way the illness flared and receded, the earlier episodes of dysentery he had suffered in India years before he ever sailed, and Young concluded that it was almost certainly not tuberculosis at all. It was, he argued, hepatic amoebiasis, an infection of the liver by a parasite, something Ramanujan had most likely carried out of India with him, dormant, for years. And the reason that matters, the reason it turns a sad story into an infuriating one, is that hepatic amoebiasis was, even in 1918, a curable condition. There was a treatment, a drug existed, and it worked. If a single doctor in England had correctly identified what was wrong with him, he could very likely have been cured and returned to a long life and given the 40 more years that a mind like his would have done unimaginable things with. Instead, they named the wrong disease and prescribed cold air and rest for an illness that needed a specific medicine, and the parasite went on quietly eating his liver while everyone listened to his lungs. And there is one more turn of the knife in Young's analysis. Chronic amoebiasis is known to disturb the mind. Among its documented effects is exactly the kind of deep depression that drives a person to do what Ramanujan did on that train platform, which means the despair that nearly killed him before the disease did may not have been only the loneliness and the cold and the exile, real as those were. It may have been, in part, a chemical product of the parasite itself, a darkness manufactured inside his own failing body by an organism that a correct diagnosis would have destroyed in a matter of weeks. He was being poisoned from the inside by something with a name, something treatable, something beatable, and no one named it. And so it took him. He arrived home in 1919 carrying a death that did not have to be a death. He spent his last year being moved between houses in the south, cared for by his wife Janaki, who was by then a young woman, doing mathematics almost until the end. And in January of 1920, 3 months before he died, he wrote that last letter to Hardy. The one we started with. The one with the mock theta functions in it. So now we are back at the beginning, except that you know the man now, and you can feel the weight of it. A dying man who has spent his life pulling correct answers out of a source he cannot name, who has been twice rejected and once celebrated and slowly killed by the very recognition he sought. Picks up a pen in his last months and writes down 17 functions of a kind that have never existed before in mathematics. He calls them mock theta functions because they imitate, in some respect he can sense, but cannot fully formalize, the behavior of the well-understood objects called theta functions, while being something else, something new. He sorts them into orders, 3rd order and 5th order and 7th order, using a word, order, that he never rigorously defines, because of course he does not, because he never defines anything, he only sees. And he describes their defining property in language that is suggestive rather than precise, gesturing at how they behave near certain points. The way you might describe the shape of something you have seen in a dream and are trying to convey to someone who was not there. And then he runs out of time, and he dies on the 26th of April, 1920, at the age of 32, in a small house in South India, and the 17 functions are left behind in a letter, correct, usable, and utterly unexplained. His widow, Janaki, was about 21 years old when he died. The girl who had been married to him as a child had become the widow of a legend before she was old enough to have had much of a marriage at all, since most of the years he was healthy he had spent 8,000 miles away from her. And then she lived. She lived a very long time. Janaki survived her husband by 74 years. She did not die until 1994, which means that for almost 3/4 of a century she was the living link to him, the last person on earth who had cooked for him and nursed him and watched him fill paper in the final year when his body was giving out. She spent decades in relative obscurity and not a little hardship before the world circled back, the way it tends to. Far too late to honor what it had failed to honor in time. In her later years, she watched her husband become a national hero in India, watched the institutes and the stamps and the statues appear, watched the lost notebook surface and the slow global recognition arrive that he had been one of the rarest minds the species ever produced. She gave interviews. She corrected the record where she could. Bruce Berndt, the mathematician who gave 40 years of his life to proving the notebooks, came and sat with her and spoke with her about the man. And the thing I keep returning to is the asymmetry of time inside that single life. Ramanujan got 32 years, almost none of them comfortable. Most of them spent either ignored or sick or both. Janaki got 95 years and spent 74 of them as the keeper of a memory that the world needed most of a century to understand it should have treasured. She was alive, an old woman in Madras, through the entire era when George Andrews and Bruce Berndt were excavating the lost notebook, through the decades when the field was sprinting to catch up to her dead husband. And she came so close to the end of it. She missed the moment when the deathbed functions were finally explained by only a few years. The breakthrough came in 2002. She had died in 1994. She waited 74 years for the world to finish understanding what she had married, and then ran out of time 8 years short of the answer, which is its own small echo of the way he ran out of time 3 months short of finishing the letter. This is the moment where the story should, by the logic of every nice version, begin to wind down. The genius dies young, the world mourns, the legacy is secure, roll credits. But the actual story does the opposite. The actual story is only about a quarter over, because the strangest part of Ramanujan is not what he did while he was alive. It is what his mathematics did after he was dead. The mathematics kept working. It kept being right. And it kept being right in places that did not exist yet, which is a sentence that should not make sense, and I am going to spend the rest of this showing you that it does. Start with the silence. After Ramanujan died, the mock theta functions did not detonate. They did not immediately reveal their importance. They were noted, admired as a curiosity, and then they sat. The one man who took them most seriously in the decades after was an English mathematician named George Neville Watson, who spent years in the 1930s working on them, and in 1936 gave a major lecture. His retiring address as president of the London Mathematical Society, titled, with unusual drama for a mathematician, The Final Problem, treating Ramanujan's last functions as the great unsolved puzzle he was bequeathing to the field. And then Watson, too, eventually moved on, and the functions sat some more. Decade after decade, mathematicians could verify individual things about them. Nobody could say what they were. There was no theory of them. There was no category they belonged to. They were a set of correct answers to a question that nobody had figured out how to ask. This is the abdication of authority that runs through the whole story, and I want you to notice how it changes character here. Earlier it was personal and almost shameful. Baker and Hobson returning the letters without comment. The institution failing to see what was in front of it because of who had sent it. But this later silence is different. This is not snobbery. This is the entire global enterprise of mathematics, fully aware that these objects are important, fully respectful of their source, staring at them for the better part of a century and being unable to crack them. The greatest minds in number theory picked these functions up, turned them over, and put them back down, defeated, for 80 years. Not because they were not trying, because the thing Ramanujan had reached was further out than the rest of the field could go. He had sent back a postcard from a place the expedition could not yet travel to, and all anyone could do was confirm that the postcard was real and wait for the discipline to catch up to the postmark. It is worth staying with the people on this side of that gap for a moment, the ones who spent their careers walking toward the postmark, because their testimony is part of the evidence, and it is not the testimony of people prone to mysticism. Bruce Berndt, the man who gave more than 40 years to proving the notebooks, was by training and temperament a careful, sober number theorist, the opposite of a romantic. And over those decades, the experience changed him. He has described, again and again, the particular vertigo of the work, the way he would encounter a formula in Ramanujan's hand that seemed obviously wrong, that could not possibly be right, that violated his trained intuition about how these things behave, and he would set out to show it was a rare Ramanujan error, and months of labor later he would discover that it was true, that he had simply lacked the depth to see why, and that Ramanujan had been standing somewhere Berndt could only reach after half a year of climbing. He learned, slowly, to stop betting against the dead man. Ken Ono, one of the mathematicians who built the modern theory of mock modular forms on the foundation of the deathbed letter, has spoken in the same register about working from formulas that arrive with no derivation and no error and no explanation, and about the strange and slightly unnerving sense shared quietly among the people who work closest to this material, that they are not so much extending Ramanujan's work as decoding transmissions, catching up to a mind that already went where they are only now arriving. These are not excitable people. They are professionals describing, with some reluctance, an experience that their professional vocabulary does not have good words for, and the experience is consistent across all of them and across a century. The man was not faster than them. He was somewhere else, and he was reporting back, and the reports keep checking out. And while the discipline waited, something almost was lost forever, in a way that should genuinely make you angry about how casually we handle the things we do not understand. When Watson died, in 1965, he left behind a mass of papers, and among them, mixed in with his own work, were pages in Ramanujan's own handwriting that Watson had acquired and kept. After Watson's death, his papers were being sorted, and a portion of them was apparently headed for incineration, the ordinary fate of a dead academic's working papers. 2 other mathematicians intervened to rescue the material, and in late 1968 deposited a box of it in the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge, and there it sat, in a box, unexamined for most of a decade. Pages in Ramanujan's own hand, from the last year of his life, the same period as the deathbed letter, containing more than 600 formulas, sitting in a library, while the formulas they contained remained among the most sought-after objects in mathematics, and nobody knew they were there. In the spring of 1976, an American mathematician named George Andrews, from Pennsylvania State University, came to Cambridge, following a hunch and a tip, and opened that box in the Wren Library. And inside it he found about 138 pages in Ramanujan's handwriting, more than 600 results, dominated by exactly the kind of material from the deathbed letter, the mock theta functions and their relatives. The hardest and deepest things the man ever produced. It came to be called the Lost Notebook, and its discovery has been described by Bruce Berndt as the mathematical equivalent of finding the 10th Symphony of Beethoven, a complete major work by one of the great creative minds in the history of the field, presumed gone, recovered intact from a box that had nearly been burned. I need to stop and let the temperature of that sit, because we glide over it. The single most important cache of unsolved mathematics from the 20th century's most mysterious mind spent 8 years a few feet from people who would have given a year of their lives to read it. Undiscovered, after surviving an actual brush with an incinerator. And the reason it survived is essentially luck, and the instinct of 2 people who happen to recognize that a dead man's scribbles might matter. We do not have a system for this. We do not have a reliable way of recognizing the value of a thing we cannot yet understand. The Lost Notebook is not an inspiring story about recovery. It is a near miss that should frighten you, because it tells you that the filter through which we decide what to keep and what to burn is not calibrated for genius it cannot comprehend. How many boxes did get burned? We will never know. That is the point. The ones that got burned took their contents with them, and if Ramanujan's box had been on a slightly different shelf, we would simply never have known what was in it, and we would not even know that we did not know. Now, with the Lost Notebook recovered, the world had more of the mysterious material than ever. 600 new formulas to add to the 17 from the deathbed letter, and still, for another quarter century, no theory of what any of it was. Andrews and Berndt began the long labor of proving the individual results, which took them decades and ran to 5 more volumes, on top of Berndt's 5 volumes on the earlier notebooks. 10 volumes, between them, of 2 of the finest number theorists of the modern era, working most of their careers, just to provide the proofs and explanations for what one man had written down without proof or explanation in 32 years of life, most of them spent as an unknown clerk. The asymmetry of that is the whole story. One side of the ledger, a single isolated mind, sick and dying, producing the results in a flash, attributing them to a goddess. The other side of the ledger, the assembled rigor of 20th century mathematics, working for half a century to confirm that he had been right, and still unable to explain how he could have known. I want to give you the scale of the hit rate, because it is the thing that breaks the ordinary explanations. Across the notebooks and the lost notebook and the published papers, Ramanujan left something on the order of 3,000 to 4,000 distinct results. Not rough guesses, precise mathematical statements. And as the decades of verification ground on, the score came in. And the score is almost incomprehensible. The overwhelming majority were correct. Not most in the loose sense, most in the sense that the exceptions are countable on your hands. A small number turned out to be results that were already known, that he had rediscovered in isolation, which is not an error so much as a tragedy of geography. A genuinely tiny number were wrong or imprecise, like the prime counting formula, and those errors clustered, as we saw, precisely at the edge where vision fails and only machinery can see. Everything else, thousands of statements reaching into a dozen areas of mathematics, statements that the people checking them often did not initially believe, again and again turned out to be exactly, provably true. Think about what kind of process produces that. A person guessing, however brilliantly, produces a mix of right and wrong in some human proportion. A person deriving carefully produces correctness but slowly, with visible work, and not in these volumes, and not at this strangeness. Ramanujan produced correctness at near totality, at enormous volume, at the highest difficulty, instantly, and without derivation. There is no ordinary category of human cognitive performance that looks like that. We do not have another example of it. He is not at the far end of a distribution we understand. He is off the chart we use to draw the distribution. And some of what he left was not abstract at all. Some of it is running on machines near you right now, which is its own kind of unsettling, and the clearest example is the number pi. Everyone learns pi as the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, 3.14, and then digits forever, and most people file it away as a tidy little constant. Computing it to high precision is a separate and much harder problem, and for most of history it crawled. The Greeks managed a few digits. Centuries of hand labor fought the count up into the hundreds. The difficulty is that the obvious formulas for pi converge with agonizing slowness, adding a digit or less of accuracy for each term you grind through, so that even 1,000 digits by the classical methods is a punishing labor of years. In 1914, in a paper on modular equations and approximations to pi, Ramanujan wrote down a family of series for pi that did not crawl. They sprinted. One of his series produces roughly 8 correct digits of pi for every single term you compute. 8 digits a term, where the old formulas gave you a fraction of 1, which across many terms is the difference between a footpath and a launch vehicle. And as always, he did not explain where they came from. He stated them, in his usual manner, as things that were simply so, sitting in a small forest of related approximations, some so accurate that they pin pi to dozens of decimal places using nothing but a handful of square roots. The kind of thing that looks like a coincidence until you remember that Ramanujan did not deal in coincidences. He was reading the surface of structures the rest of us could not see. For decades those pi formulas were admired and barely used because there was no machine fast enough to make their speed pay. Then the computers came. In 1985, a mathematician and programmer named Bill Gosper used one of Ramanujan's series to compute pi to more than 17 million digits, a world record at the time, and in the process provided one of the first confirmations that the formula held exactly to that staggering depth. After Gosper, two brothers, David and Gregory Chudnovsky, took Ramanujan's idea and pushed it harder, producing a refinement now called the Chudnovsky algorithm, which yields around 14 correct digits of pi per term, and which has been the engine underneath essentially every world record pi computation since. When you read that pi has now been calculated past 100 trillion digits, as it has, the machinery under that headline is a direct descendant of formulas a dying clerk wrote down in 1914 for reasons he never gave. Every time anyone, anywhere, drives the known digits of pi further into the dark, they do it on his road. The hardware changes. The record holders change. The formula is still his. I want to be honest about the limits of the marvel, because it would be easy to oversell it, and you would be right not to trust me if I did. Computing pi to 100 trillion digits is not, in itself, useful for anything. You need only a few dozen digits of pi to calculate the circumference of the observable universe to within the width of a single atom. The trillion-digit runs are stress tests for hardware and exercises in human ambition, not engineering necessities. So the point is not that Ramanujan handed us a tool we could not live without. The point is subtler and stranger than that. When humanity wanted to reach further into the structure of a single number than anyone had ever reached, the only road that ran that far was a road he had already built, alone, without machines, without explanation, half a century before the machines existed to drive on it. He kept doing this. He kept leaving roads that led to places nobody would visit until long after he was gone. While the proving went on, a parallel thing was happening over in the part of mathematics that touches physics. And this is where the story stops being only about a man and starts being about reality itself. Because one of Ramanujan's other creations, from much earlier, from a paper in 1916, was an object called the tau function, which arises from a particular expression that mathematicians write as a product, an infinite product, and which Ramanujan studied with his usual uncanny eye. He noticed patterns in the values of this tau function and made several conjectures about it, statements he believed were true, but in his fashion did not prove. Some of them were settled fairly soon, but one of them, a precise statement about how large the values of the tau function could get, a bound, resisted everyone. It became known as the Ramanujan conjecture, and it sat unproven for decades, and it turned out to be one of those innocent-looking statements that is secretly connected to the deepest structures in the entire subject. It was finally proved in 1973 and published in 1974 by the Belgian mathematician Pierre Deligne. And the way it was proved is the thing I want you to register. Deligne did not prove Ramanujan's conjecture by some clever direct attack on the tau function. He proved it as a consequence of proving something vastly larger and more general, a set of profound statements about the geometry of solutions to equations, statements called the wheel conjectures, which are among the great mathematical achievements of the century and which earned Deligne the Fields Medal, the highest honor in mathematics. Ramanujan's little observation about the size of the tau function fell out of that enormous edifice as a corollary, a side effect, which means that when Ramanujan, sitting in wartime Cambridge or in a Madras accounts office, looked at his tau function and felt that its values could never exceed a certain bound, he was sensing, through some channel none of us can reconstruct, a shadow of one of the deepest geometric truths in mathematics. A truth that would take the field 60 years and one of its greatest minds to establish from the foundations up. He did not have the foundations. He could not have had them. They did not exist. He just saw the top of the building, somehow, while standing on ground where the building had not been built. And it gets stranger, because that same object, the infinite product Ramanujan studied, raised to a particular power, the 24th power, turns out to be central to string theory. The number 24 shows up in the mathematics of the vibrating strings that some physicists believe are the fundamental constituents of reality, and the specific function Ramanujan was playing with in 1916 is, in a precise technical sense, the same function that governs how those strings can vibrate. The physicist Michio Kaku has written about this directly, describing how each of the 24 modes in the Ramanujan function corresponds to a physical vibration of a string, and how the consistency of the theory depends on mathematical identities that are, in his words, precisely the mathematical identities discovered by Ramanujan. I want to be careful and honest here, because this is exactly the kind of place where popular accounts overreach, and you deserve the precise version. Ramanujan did not predict string theory. He had no concept of it. What is true, and what is strange enough without exaggeration, is that the mathematical structures he was drawn to, for reasons internal to his own vision, turned out decades later to be the exact structures that physics required when it went looking for a description of the fundamental constituents of the universe. He was assembling, in isolation, the vocabulary of a language that no one would need to speak until long after he was dead. But the digits of pi and the tau function and the string vibrations are the warm-up. They are the second foreshadow, the one I promised you would feel more explicit than the first, the growing sense that this man's mathematics had a habit of arriving early to places it could not have known about. The full version of it, the thing the whole story has been descending toward, is the mock theta functions, the deathbed functions, the 17 objects in the last letter, and what finally happened to them in the first decades of this century. Because they were the deepest things he reached, and they waited the longest. And what they were waiting for turned out to be the most disturbing destination of all. The breakthrough on the mock theta functions, the one that ended the 80-year silence, came in 2002, and it came not from a famous senior figure, but from a graduate student. His name was Sander Zwegers, and he was a doctoral student in the Netherlands, at Utrecht, working under the supervision of one of the great living number theorists, Don Zagier. And in his doctoral thesis, Zwegers did the thing that the entire 20th century had failed to do. He explained what the mock theta functions actually are. The explanation is technical, and I am not going to pretend you can fully feel it without the mathematics, but the shape of it is something you can hold. And the shape is what matters. You need one idea first, the idea of symmetry, and not the everyday kind. When a mathematician calls one of these objects symmetric, they mean something close to the way a perfect crystal is symmetric, or the way a snowflake repeats its pattern as you turn it. A modular form is a function so exquisitely structured that you can transform it, stretch it and fold it and shift it in elaborate prescribed ways, and it comes back looking exactly like itself, unchanged, as if you had done nothing. That self-sameness under transformation is not a decoration. It is an enormous and rare constraint, and it makes these objects almost miraculously rigid and powerful. Because once you know a little about a modular form, the symmetry forces the rest, the way knowing one face of a perfect crystal tells you all the others. For more than 100 years, mathematicians had known and prized this class of objects, and Ramanujan's mock theta functions looked, tantalizingly, almost like them. They had the same flavor, the same fingerprints, but they failed to have the perfect symmetry. Transform them the way you transform a true modular form, and they did not quite come back to themselves. They came back almost right, and wrong by a precise, stubborn, infuriating amount. They were broken in a way that was maddeningly close to whole. For 80 years, that brokenness was the wall nobody could climb. What Zwegers showed is that the mock theta functions are not broken at all. They are the visible part of a larger, perfectly symmetric object. If you take a mock theta function and add to it a specific, precisely determined extra piece, a piece that mathematicians now call its shadow, the combination becomes a genuine, fully symmetric, modular object, the crystal made whole. The mock theta function had looked broken only because it was a fragment, a piece of a whole that Ramanujan had reached and written down while the rest of it, the shadow, remained invisible. He had seen the lit half of an object whose other half was in darkness, and he had recorded the lit half so precisely that 80 years later, someone could reconstruct the darkness from it. Think about what that requires. To write down the visible fragment of an object accurately enough that the hidden part can be recovered from it decades later, you have to have, in some sense, perceived the whole object, even if you only transcribed a piece. You cannot fake the lit half. The numbers have to be exactly right, or the shadow that you derive from them comes out wrong. And it did not come out wrong. Ramanujan, on his deathbed, with no theory of modular forms in their modern depth, no concept of shadows, no framework whatsoever, wrote down 17 fragments with sufficient precision that an entire hidden mathematical universe could be unfolded from them at the start of the 21st century. After Zwegers, the field exploded. Mathematicians including Catherine Bringman and Ken Ono built a whole theory of what are now called mock modular forms, and used Ramanujan's century-old fragments as the founding examples of a new and active branch of mathematics. The dying man's last gift was not 17 formulas. It was the seed of a field that did not exist until 80 years after his death. And that field reached backward and explained things that had been mysteries on their own for decades, which is worth seeing, because it shows the deathbed functions were not an isolated curiosity, but a master key. Go back to the partitions, the number of ways to break a whole number into a sum of smaller ones, the thing Ramanujan and Hardy had attacked with the circle method. Ramanujan had noticed something uncanny about partitions that nobody could explain. He found that they obey strange divisibility patterns, that the number of partitions of certain numbers is always divisible by 5, or by 7, or by 11, in a regular drumbeat that had no business being there. These are called the partition congruences, and they were true, and for a long time they were just true, a brute fact with no story behind it. In the 1940s, a young Freeman Dyson, who would go on to become one of the great physicists of the century, but who was then a student playing with Ramanujan's numbers, proposed an explanation. He invented a quantity he called the rank of a partition, a simple thing you can compute, and he conjectured that the rank would sort the partitions into equal groups and explain 2 of the 3 congruences, but the rank did not explain the third, the one for 11, and Dyson, with a kind of cheerful confidence, simply postulated that some other quantity must exist that would explain all of them, a quantity he did not know how to define, and gave the deliberately whimsical name of the crank. He was a young man naming a thing he could not yet find. The crank was eventually found, decades later. And when mathematicians finally built the full theory, after Zwegers, of what Ramanujan's mock theta functions actually were, it turned out that the generating function for Dyson's rank, the bookkeeping device that counts partitions by their rank, is itself one of these mock objects. The rank, the thing invented to explain a pattern Ramanujan had spotted in partitions, lives inside the same hidden structure as the mock theta functions Ramanujan wrote down on his deathbed. It was all one thing. The congruences in the partitions, the rank, the crank, the 17 functions in the last letter, all of it was the visible surface of a single deep object that took the mathematical world the better part of a century to perceive in full, and every separate piece of which Ramanujan had touched, in isolation, without ever seeing the whole. He kept handing the future the corners of a map and never the map, and the corners kept turning out to be corners of the same map. And then came 2012, and the physicists, and the black holes. Here is where I have to slow all the way down, because this is the destiny, and I do not want to let it go by in a blur the way it usually does. To understand it, you need one piece of background about black holes, and it is a piece that is itself one of the strangest results in physics, so it serves double duty. In the 1970s, Jacob Bekenstein and Stephen Hawking established that black holes are not, as everyone had assumed, perfectly featureless objects from which no information escapes and about which there is nothing more to say. They have a temperature, they radiate, and, crucially, they have an entropy, a measure of disorder, and entropy in physics is fundamentally a count. The entropy of a thing is roughly a measure of the number of distinct microscopic arrangements that all look the same from the outside, the number of ways the inside can be arranged while presenting the same face to the universe. The entropy of a black hole, then, implies that a black hole, this thing we picture as a simple smooth pit in space-time, actually has an enormous number of distinct internal microscopic states, a vast hidden ledger of possible configurations, all hidden behind the same. And one of the central projects of modern theoretical physics has been to count those states, to produce, from a fundamental theory, the exact number of quantum microstates of a black hole, and to have that number match the entropy that Bekenstein and Hawking derived. For a long time, that project looked hopeless, because nobody had a fundamental theory that could even describe the inside of a black hole, let alone enumerate its hidden states one by one. The first real breakthrough came in 1996, when two string theorists, Andrew Strominger and Komran Vafa, took a particular kind of black hole, a very special, highly symmetric, idealized one that the mathematics of string theory could actually get a grip on, and counted, directly, the number of distinct microscopic string configurations that would produce a black hole of that exact mass and charge. And the number they got matched the Bekenstein and Hawking entropy precisely. This was one of the genuine triumphs of string theory, a moment where an abstract framework reproduced exactly on the nose a number that had been derived 20 years earlier from completely different physics. It told everyone that the hidden ledger inside a black hole was real, and that, at least in the clean idealized cases, it could be read and counted. But idealized cases are idealized for a reason, which is that they are the easy ones. And reality is not easy. As physicists worked outward from those first clean examples toward black holes that were a little more general, a little more like something that could exist in an actual universe, the bookkeeping got harder, and a specific, maddening problem appeared. The function that counted the states, the generating function that packaged up how many microstates a black hole of each possible charge would have, was supposed to possess a beautiful symmetry, the modular symmetry, because that symmetry reflected a real and necessary symmetry of the underlying physics. And for these harder black holes, it did not. The counting function came out almost modular, symmetric in most respects, but failing, precisely and stubbornly, in a way that should not have been there. The physics insisted the symmetry had to exist. The mathematics kept producing a function that lacked it. That is the kind of contradiction that does not sit quietly in a corner. It means that either the physics is wrong, or you are computing the wrong object, and neither answer was acceptable, and so the problem festered for years. The clean black holes of Strominger and Waffer, it turned out, had been governed by a modular form, one of those perfectly symmetric objects mathematicians had loved for over a century. And that was exactly why their bookkeeping had come out so clean. The symmetry was not decoration, it was the reason the count closed. So when the harder black holes produced a counting function that was almost modular and not quite, that broke the symmetry in a precise and stubborn way, the physicists were staring at a function with exactly the character of the things Ramanujan had left behind on his deathbed, broken in the same maddening manner, symmetric in most respects and failing in one. They did not all recognize it at first, because most physicists had never heard of a mock theta function and had no reason to. But the resemblance was not a resemblance, it was an identity. In 2012, 3 physicists, Atish Dabholkar, Samir Murthy, and Don Zagier, the same Zagier who had supervised Zwegers a decade earlier, published a paper that resolved it. The function that counts the quantum microstates of these black holes is not a modular form, it is a mock modular form. It is broken in exactly the way Ramanujan's deathbed functions were broken, and it can be repaired in exactly the same way, by adding a shadow, the precise extra piece that Zwegers had taught the world to compute. The almost symmetry of the black hole counting function and the almost symmetry of the mock theta functions were the same phenomenon. The mathematics that a dying clerk wrote down in 1920, the fragments whose hidden halves were only reconstructed in 2002, turned out to be precisely the mathematics that physics needed in 2012 to count the quantum states hidden inside a black hole. And the most beautiful part, the part that makes the match feel less like a coincidence and more like a key turning in a lock, is that the broken piece meant something physical. The shadow, the extra correcting term that you have to add to a mock object to make it whole, was not just a mathematical patch. In the black hole problem, it corresponds to something real. When you count the quantum states of these black holes, it turns out there are 2 kinds of states getting tangled together in the bookkeeping. There are the states that belong to a single black hole sitting by itself, and there are states that really describe 2 or more black holes bound loosely together, orbiting, which can drift apart and stop being a single object at all as you change the conditions, a phenomenon physicists call wall crossing, because as you cross certain walls in the space of possibilities, those bound states wink in and out of existence. The pure, clean count of the single black hole is the mock part, the fragment Ramanujan would have recognized. The messy, condition-dependent contribution from the multi-black hole states is the shadow. The reason the function looked broken is that nature was adding 2 different things together, and the mock structure is precisely the mathematics that knows how to separate them, how to peel the lone black hole apart from the swarm of bound states around it. Ramanujan's deathbed functions did not just happen to resemble the black hole counting function. They carry, built into their structure, exactly the distinction that the physics needed and could not otherwise express. The brokenness that made them a mystery for 80 years was the very feature that made them indispensable. Because the universe, it turns out, is also broken in that exact way, for a reason, and he had written down the grammar of the brokenness before anyone knew there was a sentence that needed it. I have read the explanations of this many times, and I still do not have a way to make it ordinary. Let me try to state it as plainly and as carefully as I can, with no exaggeration, because the plain, accurate version is enough. Ramanujan, in 1920, possessed no concept of a black hole, because no one did. He possessed no concept of quantum mechanics in any developed form, because it was being born in the same years and he had no contact with it. He possessed no concept of string theory or supersymmetry or entropy counting, because those things lay 50 to 70 years in his future. He was a man dying of a misdiagnosed parasitic infection in a house in South India, attributing his visions to a goddess, writing down functions because they were, in some sense he could not articulate, beautiful and true to him. And the functions he wrote down for those private, unexplainable reasons are the same functions that, almost a century later, the deepest current theory of physics requires, in order to describe the inner accounting of the most extreme objects in the universe. He was not aiming at black holes. He could not have been. And he hit them anyway. So now I have to ask the question this whole thing has been circling, and I want to be honest that I am asking it as a question, not answering it, because I do not think it can be honestly answered, and anyone who tells you they have answered it is selling you a comfort that the facts do not support. The question is whether Ramanujan invented this mathematics or discovered it. And those two words, which sound almost interchangeable in casual speech, are in fact two completely different theories of what reality is, and the entire weight of this story comes down on the difference between them. If he invented it, then the mathematics is a human construction, a thing we make up, like a language or a game, and the fact that it later matched black holes is, in some sense, a coincidence of usefulness, the way a tool designed for one job sometimes fits another. This is the comfortable position. It keeps the universe ordinary and keeps Ramanujan, however extraordinary, a human being doing a human thing very well. But it has a problem, and the problem is the matching. It is very hard to believe that a man invented, out of his own head, for aesthetic reasons, the precise structures that an entirely independent line of physical investigation would later require, and that this happened not once with the tau function and the strings, but again, more deeply, with the Mach theta functions and the black holes, and that the matching was exact, down to the precise form of the hidden shadow. Invention does not usually predict the unbuilt future with that kind of accuracy. Invention is supposed to be free, and the mathematics did not behave as though it were free. It behaved as though it were constrained, as though there were a right answer that both Ramanujan and the black holes were independently reporting on, because they were both looking at the same underlying thing, which is the other position, that he discovered it, that the mathematics was already there, real, existing in some sense that does not depend on human minds, the way a continent is there before anyone lands on it, and that Ramanujan, by means we cannot reconstruct, was able to see parts of it directly, to read off true features of a mathematical reality that exists independently of us and that physics, when it probes deeply enough into the actual structure of the world, keeps running into, because the world is built out of the same stuff. This is the position that a surprising number of serious mathematicians actually hold, in private, when they are being honest, even though it sounds like mysticism, and they hate sounding like mystics. They hold it because it is the only thing that makes sense of their own experience of the work, the persistent feeling that they are not making things up, but finding things, that the answer was there before they arrived, and will be there after they leave, that they are explorers and not authors. And if that position is right, even partly right, then the disturbing thing is not Ramanujan. The disturbing thing is the territory. The disturbing thing is that there is a vast, precise, true structure underlying reality, that it does not care whether we exist, that it was complete and waiting before there were minds to find any of it, and that a sick man in Madras had a door into it that the rest of us do not have, and that he could not describe, and that died with him. And notice, because this is the thing almost no one says out loud, that you do not actually escape the strangeness by picking the comfortable option. People reach for invented because it sounds modern and humble and non-mystical. But if the mathematics is invented, you still have to explain the matching, and the only ways to explain the matching are at least as strange as the goddess. Either the universe just happens to be describable by the games we make up, which is itself a miracle nobody has explained. The famous unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics that the physicist Eugene Wigner wrote about and openly called a mystery he had no account of, or the games we make up are secretly constrained by something we are not aware of, which is discovery wearing a disguise. There is no version of this where you get to keep an ordinary universe. Every door out of this room leads somewhere worse than the room. And I want to make this personal before we finish, because it is easy to keep it at the safe distance of black holes and dead mathematicians, and it does not actually stay out there. The structures we have been talking about are not exotic ornaments hanging at the far edge of physics. Modular forms, the family of objects this whole story lives inside, sit underneath the cryptography that protects nearly every private thing you do. The messages you send, the money you move, the locks on your entire digital life. The taming of divergent series, the negative 1/12 that looked like madness, is part of how physicists extract real finite predictions from quantum field theory, the best tested framework in the history of science, the thing that describes the matter you are made of. The same deep mathematical reality that Ramanujan was somehow reading directly is the reality your existence is assembled out of and runs on. So when you ask whether that mathematics was invented or discovered, you are not asking a parlor question about a dead genius. You are asking whether the structure that builds you and runs your world was waiting here before you, before minds, before the stars, complete and indifferent, to be stumbled into, or whether it is somehow a thing that human minds make up, and the universe then politely agrees to obey. And every time you look hard at that question, the same vertigo opens under you, because the man at the center of the story kept reaching that structure directly, without the building, without the road. And he told you where it came from, and what he said was that it came from outside him, and he was never once shown to be wrong about anything else that mattered. You are standing on the structure right now. It held before anyone could see it. It will hold after. And the only person who seemed to see it clearly said it was not his, and died, and left the seeing in a notebook. And we still cannot do what he did, and we still cannot say why he could. I told you near the beginning that the goddess would end up being the least strange part of the story, and here is where I make good on it. Ramanujan said the mathematics came from outside him. He said it was given. He said Namagiri wrote it on his, and that an equation had no meaning unless it expressed a thought of God. And the entire scientific apparatus, including Hardy, who loved him, decided that this could not literally be true and must be a cultural metaphor for some natural process we would eventually identify. We have not identified it. 100 years on, with all our cognitive science and all our mathematics, we have no account of his method, because there was no method, and the best minds who have studied him have been reduced, over and over, to a kind of awe that sounds a lot like Hardy's original act of faith, the conclusion that the results must be true, because no one could have the imagination to invent them. Strip the cultural specifics away from what Ramanujan said, the particular god, the particular temple, and what remains is a claim that the mathematics existed independently of him, and that he was receiving it rather than making it. And that claim, the bare structural claim underneath the religious language, is exactly the position that the matching with physics pushes you toward, and exactly the position that serious mathematicians confess to in their honest moments, and exactly the thing we have no way to rule out. He may have been using the only vocabulary he had to describe something real. He told us where the mathematics came from. We just refused to believe him, because the alternative was easier, and 100 years later, the alternative is looking less easy by the decade. I want to come back to Hardy one final time, because his own life closed in a way that reads, if you let it, like an answer he never meant to give. Hardy spent his whole career insisting on the primacy of proof, insisting that Ramanujan's mysticism was beside the point, and that the only thing that mattered was rigorous, demonstrable truth. And yet, on the deepest question, Hardy was, quietly, a Platonist. In his famous small book, A Mathematician's Apology, written in 1940 when he was old and could feel his own creative power draining away, Hardy set down plainly that he believed mathematical reality lies outside us, that our function is to discover or observe it, and that the theorems we prove and grandly call our creations are simply our notes describing what we have seen. Hold that against everything we have just walked through. The cold atheist who could not abide the goddess believed, and wrote down for the world to read, that mathematics is a real external thing that we find rather than make. He simply refused to follow his own conviction the one step further that would have landed it next to Ramanujan's, because the two of them, underneath the wildly different vocabulary, were saying the same thing. Hardy said we observe a mathematical reality that lies outside us. Ramanujan said the goddess writes the equations on his tongue. One of them spoke in the language of an Oxbridge common room, and the other in the language of a temple in Namakkal, and they were pointing at the same object in the dark. And Hardy's end completes the parallel almost too neatly to write down without flinching. When he grew old and could no longer do mathematics at the level he demanded of himself, he fell into a deep depression, and in 1947 he attempted to take his own life with an overdose, the way Ramanujan, 30 years earlier and half a world away, had stepped toward a train in the dark. And like Ramanujan, he survived the attempt, and he died not long after, late in 1947, a diminished and unhappy man who felt that the thing which had given his life meaning had withdrawn from him. The man who discovered Ramanujan ended much the way Ramanujan had nearly ended, brought down by the loss of access to the one faculty that mattered, reaching for the same exit. Two men separated by everything, by nation and faith and temperament, and the brute accident of which one was the genius, and which one merely knew it when he saw it, drawn in the end to the same despair by the same wound, the unbearable sense of being cut off from the source. For Ramanujan, the source was a goddess. For Hardy, it was a mathematical reality lying outside us. They were describing the same thing, and losing their line to it broke them both, and neither of them, to the end, could say what it actually was. The notebooks, by the way, are not finished. That is the part I find hardest to sit with, and it is the last thing I am going to leave you with. This is not a closed historical episode, a strange man who lived and died, and whose work has been fully digested and filed away. Mathematicians are still working through Ramanujan's results right now, in active research, in current journals. Remember the image I asked you to hold near the very beginning, the image of answers arriving without the work that is supposed to produce them, and how I told you it would come back at the deathbed, and in a library in 1976, and in a physics paper in 2012. Here is the final place it comes back. It has not stopped coming back. The lost notebook was still generating new theorems and new proofs deep into this century, more than 90 years after the hand that wrote it went still. Results in his notebooks have been connected, only in the last few decades, to fields that did not exist in his lifetime, to the partition congruences and the rank and the crank, to the modular forms that sit underneath modern cryptography and the secure transmission of nearly everything you send, to black hole entropy, to the deep machinery of string theory. The pattern of his being right in ways that reach forward and connect to physics and to structures discovered long after his death has not slowed down. We are still, right now, catching up to a man who has been dead for more than a century. We have not reached the postmark. The expedition is still walking toward the place the postcard came from, and every few years it arrives somewhere new, somewhere it believes is the genuine frontier, only to find that he had already been there, had already written down what was there in his small, careful hand, and had already moved on without explaining how he knew the way. And there is a pattern in our behavior too, not just in his, and it is worth naming plainly, because it is the quiet scandal underneath the loud miracle. First, his work was ignored by Baker and Hobson because of where it came from. Then, when it could not be ignored, it was admired and shelved, too strange to use. For 80 years, the one thing it was almost never treated as in real time was important in the way it actually turned out to be important, which is to say, ahead of us, pointing at things we could not yet see. We do not know how much further it goes. We do not know how much of what he wrote is still sitting in those pages, correct and unread, waiting for a branch of physics that has not been invented yet to come along and discover that it needs him. We only know that it has happened before, more than once, against all reasonable odds, and that there is no honest reason left to assume it has stopped. A poor clerk with no degree mailed 9 pages of formulas to a stranger in 1913. He could not prove most of them. He said a goddess put them in his sleep. He died at 32, starving and far from home, having lain down once in front of a train in the dark. And the formulas he could not explain, that he insisted were not his, that he said came from somewhere else, are still coming true, in places he never heard of, about a universe he never got to see. We spent a century proving he was right, and not one moment of it explaining how he knew. And the most honest thing the people who have studied him longest will tell you, if you get them late enough and far enough from the cameras, is that they think he was telling the truth, that the mathematics was already there, that it was always already there, complete, indifferent, waiting in the dark for a mind that could see it, and that his was not the only door, just the one that opened. We are the ones on the other side of it now, and the door is still open, and nothing is coming back through it to tell us what is on the far side, or how much of it already has our names written on it, in handwriting we will not recognize until it is far too late to ask who held the pen.